Why is Shailesh Dash on the cover of this week's Arabian Business? I'm Neil Halligan, online editor at Arabian Business. This is Jeremy Lawrence, editorial director. And this is Inside AB. Jeremy, you spoke with, you interviewed Shailesh Dash for this week's cover. How did you find the interview?
Well, first of all, he's a very sharp-dressed CEO, very stylish man. But the interesting thing was with this piece was that he runs companies, which we'll come to in a minute, big companies, but he describes himself as an entrepreneur, which I thought was the most revealing part of the story. So, if we look at this, we've got companies like Almasa Capital, Regalis Consultancy, Regalis Asset Management, Avivo Group, the big healthcare, Al-Nasher Education, very large organisation, Diamond Lifestyle, Gulf Pinnacle Logistics, and he's got lots more fingers in pies. So these are big companies.
Yeah, and Almasa Capital, you mentioned there, it's raised more than $1 billion. AM Partners that you've mentioned has assets under management of 700 million. So why does he still describe himself or see himself as an entrepreneur?
Well, you're right that there's an entrepreneurial side to his day job, as it were, in that his background's asset management. He finds investors, he finds businesses, he puts them together and he builds bigger groups, such as Al-Nasher Education, and also in Avivo in healthcare. The reason he describes himself as an entrepreneur, though, is he's always looking out for the next big thing, which is really the key to it. Just before we come on to that, though, while we've got this slide up, he says about these companies, we want to provide services that people can afford to pay for in every sector that we are in. Now, the interesting thing about that is that with all these businesses, he wants to be firmly in the middle tier. So he doesn't want to have the most expensive schools in Dubai. He wants schools that people can afford to pay for, because that's where he thinks the most demand's in.
And with a proven track record in investment, and he's got a long history and a career in investment, he picked out a few sectors where he thinks that the next big thing is where are the sectors to invest.
Yeah, and I think this is where he proves himself as an entrepreneur. So when I said, well, what are you looking at now? Well, everybody in business is looking for where they're going to make their next big investments, where the market's going. So he talked about a few sectors. The future of building management. Now, you might think we're talking about porters and janitors and guys that clean windows. He used the example that in New York or Singapore, where he has offices, and London, 50-year-old, 100-year-old buildings look as good as new. And this is because today there are cutting-edge management solutions for buildings. And he says that over here in the buildings, you have the same guys that build the buildings are running them, and that just doesn't work. It's going to become a very specialist niche market. The reason is, of course, for that is that the older buildings here, the smaller ones, arguably could have a 30-year shelf life roughly, and then if you wanted, you could just tear them down and build some new ones. But with the buildings we have today in this region, such as the ones in the marina that are kind of 60, 70, 90 stories plus, and of course the iconic towers that we have now, such as the Burj Khalifa, the Burj, these aren't going to be pulled down. They're here for decades and decades, possibly centuries. So they have to be better run, and he wants to be in that market because it's going to be a growth market. So it's very interesting.
And e-commerce as well, you bring up, this is another sector that he's picked out. I mean, it's an area that attracts a lot of investment. Big players in the region now, Amazon and Noon.com, of course, recently launched by Alibar. He also identifies it as a sector that's worth investing in. Yeah,
well, more specifically, he was talking about logistics, because of course everyone's talking about e-commerce, but there's a whole back end, a whole world behind the websites. You've got all the delivery, you've got all the warehousing, you've got all the technology systems. So he thinks that by 2022 to 2024, the logistics sector will be 3 times its present size. I mean, that's massive. You're talking 5, 6, 7 years, and you're going to triple your return on investment if you get into it and do it right. He did say, though, that lots of people are going to be in that market, and only the ones that do it well will survive.
Okay. And then he speaks about population in terms of the growing population here and identifying the needs that they will have. We're talking utilities, we're talking food processing and those kind of sectors. These are sectors he thinks he should be investing in. Yeah.
Well, again, this comes back to this idea that he wants to be where the market is, where the people are. So this was his quote. We want to be in industries where there are lots of consumers. Well, of course, everybody consumes electricity and water. and it's the same for agriculture. These aren't businesses that he's in at the moment, but he's looking at them. He pointed out, when I asked him about economic growth in the region, there's 380 million people in the MENA region, and there's a lot of mouths to feed. So if you want to look at sectors where you can add value and there's going to be demand that's here now and will grow in future, these are some of the ones you want to be looking at.
Okay. And he also spoke about some stuff that's kind of newsy and relevant today. VAT is going to come in the start of the new year. What was your thoughts on that? Yeah,
well, this was great. Towards the end of the interview, we just went through a few of the topics that were on his mind at the minute. VAT, he was very mixed on this. He doesn't want to see the region particularly go down the taxation route for taxation's sake. He thinks it's raised enough money in the past to build things without having to resort to that, especially in Dubai. But he does agree that VAT will make firms reorganise along more professional lines, and he thinks that's good for everyone.
Okay. And then in terms of investors, I think he talks about investors should be looking at closer to home. For the investors, and there's a phrase that he uses, but where's the Middle East in Goldman Sachs?
Yeah, that was an interesting way of looking at it. And he was saying that rhetorically to say that investors traditionally from this region have always put their money outside. All the sovereign wealth funds have always looked to, buy buildings in London and New York and all the rest. He used the example of Dubai, where there has been more investment to make this place grow to what it is today. He wants to see that continue and expand throughout the Gulf. Obviously in Saudi they are looking at doing that, Kuwait and further afield. So we can get to that stage where you've got really big investments happening all over the region.
Okay, and then he also talks about the perennial issue in this region in particular, are family business planning properly for the future in terms of corporatizing the structure? Yeah.
Well, of course, most of his early investors were family officers. Now he's got pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, but that was the bedrock of his business. So he's intimately acquainted with these people. And as we change over from the second and especially to the third generation of people running these businesses, he said that they have to go, again, come back to this theme, they have to go along more professional lines, more standardized with the rest of the world, where you see good corporate governance. You see that the children that inherit these businesses don't run them. They employ proper professionals, and then they just provide the checks and balances for those businesses.
So having spent time with him and interviewed him and gone through the feature writing process, what was your thoughts, that question at the end? Was he CEO, or do you find him an entrepreneur at heart, or what was your impression?
I mean, I think he's an entrepreneur at heart. I mean, he's in a CEO's suit, but he's definitely a guy who wants to do the next thing. I mean, any one of those businesses, he could just continue to build and build and build. But he just seems to have that eye for what's next, and I think that's what really stood out to me in the feature.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for speaking with us. That's this Inside AB. Catches every morning at 10 a.m. online.